A single dollar doesn't buy a cup of black coffee anymore. It barely buys the dirt on your boots. But last Tuesday, one crisp paper bill bought 80 acres of blood, sweat, and 4 generations of crushing debt. It was a humiliating surrender until Nora unlocked the barn. The lawyer's office smelled of lemon polish, stale filter coffee, and the quiet resignation of cheap settlements. Nora sat in an oversized leather chair that expelled a long, tired hiss every time she shifted her weight. Across the broad mahogany desk sat her older brother, David. He wore a navy suit that pulled too tight across his shoulders, his silver wristwatch catching the sterile glare of the fluorescent lights overhead. He was drumming a complimentary plastic pen against his legal pad. Tap, 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 a hollow, anxious rhythm that grated against Nora's pounding headache. "It's the only way out, Nora," David said, not looking at her. He kept his eyes locked on the paperwork fanned out across the desk. 400,000 in property liens, back taxes going back to 2014, the EPA fines for the leaking diesel tank. Grandpa left us a financial crater. Wallace is doing us a favor. Nora looked at Wallace. Wallace Reed was a corporate land developer who looked exactly like a man who bought dead family farms for a living. He had the kind of aggressive engineered tan that belonged on a golf course, not out in the brutal, wind-chapped plains of Redford County. He offered a tight, sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your brother is right, Miss Harding," Wallace said, his voice smooth and practiced. "The soil is dead. The structures are condemned. By assuming the liability of the estate, my firm takes on the heavy lifting. You walk away clean. No debt, no inherited bankruptcies. A fresh slate." Nora stared at the center of the desk. Sitting there, entirely alone on the polished wood, was a single, crisp $1 bill. George Harding, their grandfather, had died 3 weeks ago. He was a man made of rawhide and stubborn silence, a man who worked until his knuckles bled and the bank took everything but the marrow in his bones. He had refused to sell. He had chased surveyors off the property with a rusty shotgun and a string of bitter curses. He loved that miserable, failing patch of dirt more than he had ever loved his own family. And now, less than a month after they lowered him into the frozen Nebraska ground, David was selling it all for a piece of paper that couldn't even pay for a pack of gum. "It's an insult," Nora said softly. Her voice sounded strange in the quiet room, too rough, too raw. "It's a legal necessity," Mr. Gable, the estate lawyer, chimed in, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Consideration must be exchanged to make the contract binding. The single dollar is symbolic." "Symbolic of what?" Nora shot back, finally looking up. She glared at David. That his whole life was a joke? That 80 years of breaking his back was worth exactly 100 cents? David sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Don't do this, Nora. Not today. You want to keep it? Fine. Write a check for $500,000 right now, and the farm is yours. You want to pay the back taxes on a bartender's salary? Go ahead. Otherwise, pick up the pen." He was right. That was the worst part. The sheer, immovable reality of poverty. Nora had $12 in her checking account and a transmission in her Honda that slipped in 3rd gear. She couldn't save the farm. She couldn't even save herself. She leaned forward, her hand trembling slightly as she picked up the heavy brass pen Mr. Gable offered. She didn't read the dense legal jargon. She just found the yellow sticky arrows and signed her name. Nora Jean Harding, over and over, signing away her childhood, the summers spent chasing barn cats, the smell of fresh-cut alfalfa, the bitter memory of her grandfather's cold, calloused hands. When it was done, Wallace Reed slid the dollar bill across the desk. It stopped right in front of her. "The demolition crews start grading the land on Thursday morning," Wallace said, snapping his briefcase shut. "You have until Wednesday night to clear out any personal effects from the main house. After that, we lock the gates." Nora stood up, ignoring the dollar. She walked out of the office without saying goodbye to her brother. The drive up Route 9 was a blur of gray asphalt and dead winter wheat. The sky above was a bruised, heavy purple, threatening a cold rain. When she pulled onto the gravel driveway of the old farm, The sound of her tires crunching over the loose stones felt like an intrusion. Osta. The property looked exactly as she remembered, only smaller, sadder. The white paint on the two-story farmhouse had peeled away in long, curled strips, leaving the gray wood underneath exposed to the elements. The porch sagged under its own weight. Beyond the house, the old red barn loomed against the darkening sky, its corrugated tin roof rusted out in patches, looking like a massive, wounded animal waiting to die. The farm hadn't died all at once. It had bled out over a decade, choking on bad crops, corporate monopolies, and George's sheer refusal to adapt. Nora killed the engine and sat in the quiet cab of her car for a long time. The silence out here was absolute. It was heavy enough to crush you. She zipped up her canvas jacket, grabbed a flashlight and a box of heavy-duty trash bags from the back seat, and stepped out into the biting wind. She had 24 hours to pack up 80 years of a man's life. She figured it would take her less than 3. Grandpa George had never been a man of substance, just a man of secrets. The inside of the farmhouse was a tomb of dust and mothballs. Nora moved methodically through the rooms, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom where the electricity had long since been shut off. She threw away old newspapers, cracked ceramic mugs, and flannel shirts worn thin at the elbows. She found nothing of value. No hidden savings bonds, no sentimental letters, just a few faded photographs in a shoebox under his bed, and a jar of oxidized pennies. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the prairie into a deep, pitch-black night, the house was completely empty. Nora stood on the back porch, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She should have gotten in her car and driven back to the city. The job was done, but her eyes kept drifting across the overgrown yard to the barn. The barn was a massive timber-framed structure built in the 1920s. It was the only building on the property George had obsessively maintained until his arthritis finally crippled him. Even in his final years, he would sit on the porch with a thermos of black coffee and stare at those heavy wooden doors. Like he was standing guard. Nora remembered a hot summer day when she was 10 years old. She had run into the barn to hide during a game of hide-and-seek, crouching behind a massive pile of canvas tarps. George had found her. He hadn't just been angry, he had been frantic. He dragged her out by the arm, his grip bruising her bicep, screaming at her to never, ever go near the center floorboards again. "The foundation is rotten," he had barked, his eyes wide and wild. "You'll fall right through to hell, you hear me?" Nora had never gone back inside. Now, standing in the cold dark, a strange itch of curiosity crawled up the back of her neck. She clicked her flashlight back on and walked through the tall, dead weeds. The main doors were chained shut, secured with a heavy, rusted master lock. Nora didn't have a key. She went around to the side of the barn, found an old window with a missing pane, and reached through to undo the interior latch. The wood groaned in protest as she heaved the frame up and swung her legs inside, dropping to the dirt floor. The air inside was thick and stagnant. It smelled heavily of diesel fuel, dry rot, and generations of field mice. Nora swept her flashlight across the cavernous space. It was a graveyard of obsolete machinery. An old Massey Ferguson combine sat in the corner, stripped for parts. Coils of barbed wire hung from rusty nails, but sitting dead center in the middle of the barn was her grandfather's 1953 Ford tractor. It was a hulking mass of red iron, practically fossilized in the dirt, but something about it struck Nora as deeply wrong. The tractor wasn't just parked, it was positioned with an obsessive precision. It sat perfectly square in the middle of 4 load-bearing support beams. She walked closer, her boots kicking up tiny clouds of dust. She crouched down, shining the light under the tractor's rusted chassis. The floor of the barn was packed dirt, rock-hard from decades of use. But directly beneath the engine block of the heavy Ford, the dirt was different. It was smoother. Nora stood up and walked to the front of the tractor. She grabbed the massive iron steering wheel and pulled. It didn't budge. The parking brake was rusted solid. She looked around the barn, her heart beating a little faster now, the cynical bartender in her suddenly giving way to a deeply ingrained childish urge to uncover a secret. She found a heavy steel pry bar leaning against a workbench, thick with grease and cobwebs. She marched back to the tractor, wedged the flat edge of the pry bar under the rear tire, and threw her entire body weight against the steel rod. Her shoulders burned. The tractor groaned, the rusted gears grinding against each other. She pushed harder, gritting her teeth until she tasted copper, with a sharp, metallic crack. The brake drum snapped loose. The tractor rolled forward exactly 3 feet and stopped. Nora dropped the pry bar, breathing heavily. She stepped into the space the tractor had just occupied. She kicked at the dirt with the steel toe of her boot. It didn't yield. She knelt and used her bare hands to sweep the loose topsoil away. Beneath a half-inch of dust, her fingers brushed against something hard and cold, metal. She wiped furiously, coughing as a cloud of dust rose into the flashlight beam. A shape emerged. It was a square steel plate, about 4 feet wide, perfectly flush with the ground. In the center of the plate was a recessed iron ring. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her head. "You'll fall right through to hell." Nora grabbed the iron ring. It was freezing to the touch. She braced her boots against the steel plate, locked her knees, and pulled with everything she had left. The plate was insanely heavy. For a second, nothing happened. Then a seal broke. Stale, trapped air hissed outward, carrying a scent Nora couldn't immediately identify. A smell of oiled leather, aged wood, and something sharply chemical. The hatch swung upward on massive, hidden hinges, slamming backward onto the dirt with a thud that shook the floor. Nora grabbed her flashlight, her hands shaking so badly the beam danced erratically across the walls. She pointed the light down into the opening. It wasn't a root cellar, it was a poured concrete shaft, plunging down into absolute darkness, with a sturdy steel ladder bolted to the side. She didn't stop to think. If she thought about it, she would realize how insane this was. She swung her legs over the edge and began to climb down. The descent was deeper than she expected. 10 feet, 15. The air grew significantly colder, biting through her canvas jacket. Finally, her boots hit a solid concrete floor. She turned around, raising the flashlight. The room was massive, extending beneath the entire footprint of the barn above. It was structurally reinforced with heavy steel I-beams, but it was what filled the room that made Nora stop breathing. The beam of her flashlight swept over the shapes in the dark. It wasn't junk, it wasn't farm equipment. Stacked against the far wall, reaching almost to the ceiling, were dozens of heavy wooden crates, stamped with faded black ink. And in the center of the room, sitting on blocks and draped in heavy dust-caked canvas tarps, were 3 distinct, massive shapes. Nora walked slowly toward the closest tarp. Her fingers pinched the heavy fabric. She pulled it back. The dust fell away in a cascading sheet. Beneath the canvas, gleaming in the harsh, white LED light of her flashlight, was the flawless, midnight blue paint of a perfectly preserved 1930s Duesenberg Model J chrome headlights reflected the light right back at her, blindingly bright. Nora stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from her grip and clattering against the concrete floor. The beam rolled, illuminating the stamped black ink on the wooden crates stacked behind the cars. Property of the U.S. Treasury, Philadelphia Mint, 1933. She sat down hard on the cold floor, the silence of the vault ringing in her ears. Her family had just sold 80 acres and a subterranean fortune for exactly $1. Nora remained on the concrete floor, the cold seeping through her denim jeans, freezing her joints. The silence in the subterranean vault was absolute, save for the ragged, shallow sound of her own breathing. She kept the flashlight aimed at the faded black lettering on the wooden crates. 1933. She didn't have a degree in American history, but she had spent enough nights wiping down the sticky zinc counter of the bar, listening to old men talk about rare coins and pawn shop scores to know what that year meant. It was the year they took the gold away. She pushed herself up. Her legs felt hollow, detached from her body. She walked past the hulking, shrouded shapes of the vintage cars, moving toward the back wall, where the crates were stacked 5 high and 10 across. The air here smelled heavily of camphor and dry, ancient pine. Nora found a heavy steel chisel resting on a nearby wooden workbench. The handle was wrapped in cracked, brittle leather. She approached the nearest crate, wedged the flat edge of the chisel under the wooden lid, and brought her palm down hard against the steel. The rusted nails screamed in protest. She hit it again, ignoring the sharp sting radiating up her forearm. The wood splintered, giving way with a dry crack. She pried the lid back. Inside, packed tightly in layers of yellowed straw, were heavy canvas sacks. They were tied off with thick twine, sealed with cracked wax. Nora gripped the neck of one sack and pulled. It was staggeringly heavy, maybe 40 pounds. She dragged it out, letting it drop onto the lid of the crate. With a trembling hand, she pulled a pocket knife from her jacket and sliced through the thick canvas. A dull, rich gleam caught the beam of her flashlight. Gold, dozens of them, hundreds. They spilled from the wound in the canvas, clinking against each other with a heavy musical sound that sent a jolt of pure electricity straight to Nora's heart. She picked one up. It was heavy, cold, and perfectly unblemished. On one side, an eagle in flight. On the other, Lady Liberty holding a torch. At the bottom, the date, 1933, a double eagle, $20 gold pieces. Nora dropped the coin. It clattered against the wood. Her mind struggled to grasp the scale of the room. If every crate held this many bags, and every bag held this many coins, it wasn't just money, it was GDP. It was a fortune so massive it practically generated its own gravity. But how? She turned the flashlight back toward the workbench. Sitting squarely in the center of the dusty planks was a small, green metal lockbox. The key was sitting right on top of it. Nora walked over, her boots dragging heavily across the floor. She turned the key, hearing the satisfying mechanical click, and lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of folded topographical maps, a Smith & Wesson revolver wrapped in an oiled rag, and a small, leather-bound ledger. She opened the ledger. The paper was brittle, the ink faded to a rusty brown, but she instantly recognized the jagged, blocky handwriting. It belonged to George. The entries weren't financial. They were a confession. Nora read through the pages, the flashlight beam trembling in her hand. The story spilled out in short, clipped sentences, devoid of emotion but heavy with dread. The vault hadn't been built by George. It was built by his father, Elias Harding, during the height of Prohibition. Elias had been a quiet farmer on the surface, but underneath, he was a silent partner for a Chicago syndicate running Canadian whiskey down through the plains. In 1934, the syndicate didn't just run whiskey. They hit a federal transport train hauling recalled gold reserves back to the Philadelphia Mint. The heist went bad. Federal agents cracked the syndicate in less than a month. Men died in shootouts. Others were handed life sentences. Elias, terrified and untouched by the law, hid the stash in his bootlegger's vault beneath the barn. He parked the syndicate's getaway cars, the 3 Duesenbergs, down there, sealed the heavy steel hatch, and never spoke of it again. When Elias died, he left the secret to George, and George had let it destroy him. Nora stared at a page dated August 14, 1982. "The bank is calling the note on the north field," George had written. "I could open one crate, just one. Melt it down in Omaha. Pay the debt. But they watch. The government tracks the gold. The Chicago boys' grandsons are still looking for the cars. If I spend a dime, they find me. They take the farm. They kill my family. I have to hold the line. I am the warden." Nora closed the ledger. A hot, angry tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. Her grandfather wasn't a failure. He wasn't a bitter, incompetent old man who hated his family. He was a prisoner. He had lived in grinding, soul-crushing poverty, watching his wife die of a sickness he couldn't afford to treat, watching his children abandon him, all to protect them from a phantom war he had inherited. He had chosen to be hated so they could survive. He starved to death, while sleeping on a mattress stuffed with billions. Nora looked around the vault. The anger swelled in her chest, hot and sharp. David had sold it all for $1. Wallace Reed, a corporate vulture with a spray tan, now owned the farm. Under the property laws of the state, any abandoned assets discovered on the land after the transfer of the deed belonged to the new owner. If Wallace found this vault, he wouldn't just take the gold. He would take George's sacrifice and turn it into a corporate bonus, or worse, the federal government would seize it all as stolen property, leaving Nora and David with nothing but the memory of a $1 check. She checked her watch. It was 11:45 p.m. on Tuesday. Wallace had given her until Wednesday night to clear out. At dawn on Thursday, the demolition crews would arrive to rip up the foundation. Nora wiped her face with the back of her dirty sleeve. She wasn't her grandfather. She wasn't going to hold the line. She was going to break it. Wednesday morning broke over Redford County in a wash of cold, gray light. Nora was already miles away, sitting in the cab of a rented 26-foot heavy-duty box truck. She had maxed out her only credit card, overdrawn her checking account, and pawned her Honda for $700 in cash, just to secure the rental, buy a heavy motorized winch, a pallet jack, and 300 feet of steel cable. She pulled the rattling truck into the gravel driveway of the farm just after 9. The wind was howling across the plains, rattling the dead corn stalks and slamming the rusted weather vane on the barn roof. It was perfect. The noise would cover her work. Nora knew she couldn't pull the treasure up through the tractor hatch. It was physically impossible to lift 100-pound crates up a 15-foot vertical ladder, but reading George's ledger had given her the key. Elias Harding hadn't lowered 3 Duesenbergs down a ladder. The bunker had been a bootlegging hub. It had a service entrance. According to the ledger, a reinforced concrete ramp led from the back of the vault to the old, dry creek bed a quarter-mile behind the barn. Nora drove the heavy truck off the driveway, the thick tires tearing through the frozen, dead weeds, until she reached the edge of the ravine. She grabbed a shovel from the back and slid down the steep embankment. Decades of soil erosion and overgrown blackberry bushes obscured the bank, but she dug frantically, her shoulders screaming in protest with every thrust of the blade. After an hour of brutal labor, metal scraped against metal. She cleared the dirt away to reveal 2 massive rusted iron doors built directly into the side of the ravine. She attached her steel cable to the truck's tow hitch, hooked the other end to the heavy iron rings on the doors, and drove forward. The earth groaned. The roots snapped like rifle fire. With a sickening crunch of tearing metal and shifting dirt, the doors ripped open, exposing a dark, sloping tunnel that descended directly into the vault. Nora backed the truck right up to the mouth of the tunnel. The work that followed was a blur of agonizing, physical pain. Nora unloaded the pallet jack and wheeled it down the concrete incline. The vault was exactly as she had left it. She ignored the pristine Duesenbergs. They were magnificent, multi-million-dollar pieces of history, but they were useless to her. They weighed 3 tons each, their tires were rotted to dust, and they were the most traceable artifacts in the room. Trying to steal them would send her to federal prison. She focused entirely on the wooden crates. She stacked them onto the pallet jack, 3 at a time. The muscles in her back knotted and burned. Her hands blistered, popped, and bled over the wooden splinters. She used the motorized winch to haul the loaded pallet jack up the steep incline. Guiding it slowly, terrified the cable would snap and crush her against the tunnel wall. By 3 in the afternoon, the sky had darkened with the promise of freezing rain. By 5, Nora's vision was blurring from exhaustion. She had moved 24 crates into the back of the rental truck. It was a fraction of the hoard, maybe a fifth of the total gold, but the truck's suspension was already groaning under the immense weight. If she loaded any more, the rear axle would snap the moment she hit the highway. She pushed the empty pallet jack down the ramp one last time to retrieve the small green lockbox and the ledger. As she reached the bottom of the incline, a sound froze the blood in her veins. Gravel crunching, a vehicle pulling up to the farmhouse. Nora killed the flashlight. She stood in the pitch-black vault, her heart slamming against her ribs. She crept toward the steel ladder beneath the main barn floor and pressed her ear to the cold concrete. Footsteps walked heavily across the wooden planks above. Voices echoed through the cavernous barn. "Place is a structural nightmare, Mr. Reed," a deep, gruff voice said. "Look at the rot on these load-bearing beams. We can't just bulldoze it from the side. We'll have to bring in the heavy excavators and collapse the roof straight down." "I don't care how you do it, just get it done quickly," Wallace Reed's smooth, impatient voice replied. "The estate is officially mine at midnight. I want this eyesore flattened by tomorrow afternoon." "What about the scrap? That old Ford tractor might fetch a few bucks." Nora held her breath. If they looked closely at the tractor, if they saw the disturbed dirt, the scraped metal of the brake drum. "Leave it," Wallace sneered. "It's junk. Bury it with the rest of this pathetic place." The footsteps retreated. The barn doors slammed shut. A minute later, the engine of Wallace's luxury SUV fired up and faded down the driveway. Nora let out a ragged, shaking breath. She climbed back up the ramp, locked the heavy iron doors as best she could, and piled the dead blackberry bushes back over the entrance. She secured the back of the box truck, climbed into the cab, and turned the key. The engine roared to life. As she drove away from the farm, the first drops of freezing rain began to fall against the windshield. She didn't look back in the rearview mirror. On Thursday morning, a crew of heavy excavators rolled onto the property. They hit the barn with a wrecking ball, collapsing the massive timber roof inward. The sheer weight of the collapsing structure cracked the concrete ceiling of the vault below. Thousands of tons of earth, splintered wood, and rusted steel rained down into the subterranean room, crushing the 3 immaculate Duesenbergs and burying the remaining crates of federal gold under an impenetrable mountain of debris. Wallace Reed paved over the site 3 months later, laying the foundation for a generic, prefabricated strip mall. He never knew what he had bought for a single dollar. He never knew what he buried beneath the asphalt. Nora Harding drove south, crossing the state line just before dawn. She had a new name, a bleeding back, and 24 wooden crates that would ensure no one in her family would ever bow their heads to a man in a suit again. Her grandfather had held the line, but Nora had finally set them free. What would you have done if you stood in Nora's shoes? Would you have tried to save the cars, or did she make the ultimate mastermind move by letting the developer pave over his own fortune? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with a friend who loves a good mystery, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more hidden history and incredible tales.